The scorching summer sun beat down on the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, Texas, as Quentin Cooper rode into town with nothing but his horse, his hat, and the weight of 5 years of wandering heavy on his shoulders. The year was 1875, and the West was still wild, still untamed, but Quentin had long since grown tired of the chaos that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Quentin dismounted outside the town's only saloon, the Broken Spur, and tied his dapple gray mare to the hitching post. He was 30 years old, with weather-beaten skin and eyes that had seen too much bloodshed. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, first at his father's ranch, then as a hired gun during the turbulent years after the war. But those days were behind him now, or so he hoped. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. A piano player half-heartedly tapped out a tune in the corner, and the bartender eyed Quentin warily as he approached. "Just passing through?" the bartender asked, already reaching for a glass. "That's the plan," Quentin replied, placing a coin on the counter. "Whiskey and information if you've got it." "Information comes cheaper than the whiskey in this town," the bartender chuckled, pouring a generous measure. "What are you looking for?" "Work, the honest kind." Quentin downed half the glass in one swallow, the liquor burning a familiar path down his throat. The bartender raised an eyebrow. "Ranch hand. We got the Circle R hiring. Old man Reynolds lost 3 men last month. Indians, they say, but more likely they just got tired of his temper and moved on." Quentin nodded. It wasn't what he'd hoped for, but it was work. "Where can I find this Circle R?" Before the bartender could answer, the saloon doors burst open. A man staggered in, blood seeping from a wound in his side. "Stagecoach. Ambushed." 5 miles east," he gasped before collapsing onto the floor. The saloon erupted into chaos. Men rushed to the fallen messenger while others grabbed rifles from behind the bar. The sheriff, a gray-haired man with a pronounced limp, called for volunteers. "I need 5 good men." He shouted above the din. Whoever hit that coach could still be there. Quentin hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. He'd promised himself he was done with trouble, done with fighting. But something pulled at him, perhaps the code his father had drilled into him since childhood. A man doesn't turn his back when help is needed. "I'll ride with you," he said, stepping forward. "I've got a fresh horse outside." The sheriff nodded, relief evident in his eyes. "Much obliged, stranger." Within minutes, Quentin was riding hard alongside the sheriff and 4 other men, dust kicking up behind them as they galloped east. The landscape blurred past scrub brush, rocky outcroppings, and the occasional stunted tree, all baking under the relentless sun. They came upon the stagecoach just as the sheriff had feared. It lay on its side, one wheel spinning lazily in the air. 2 horses were down, and the driver slumped against a nearby rock, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. But it was the woman kneeling beside him that caught Quentin's attention. She had auburn hair that glowed like fire in the afternoon sun, and even from a distance, he could see the determination in her posture as she pressed a cloth against the driver's wound. "Madam," the sheriff called as they approached. "Are you hurt?" She looked up, and Quentin felt something shift inside him. Her face was smudged with dirt and blood, but her eyes, green as spring grass, held a fierce intensity. "I'm fine," she answered, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "But Mr. Jameson here needs a doctor, and quickly. The bandits took everything: the strong box, the mail, our luggage." "How many were there?" Quentin asked, dismounting and approaching cautiously. 3. She rose to her feet, revealing a torn dress and scraped palms. They wore bandanas over their faces, but one had a scar across his eye, and another wore a red neckerchief. The sheriff cursed. "The Rigby boys. They've been hitting stage coaches all across the territory. Quentin surveyed the scene, noting the direction of the tracks leading away. They're headed west toward those hills, probably got a hideout there. We'll go after them, the sheriff decided. But first, we need to get you and the driver back to town, miss. Melanie Everhart, she supplied. And I'm not going anywhere until those men are caught. They took something that belongs to me, something irreplaceable. There was a steel in her voice that matched the look in her eyes, and Quentin found himself curious despite his better judgment. What did they take, Miss Everhart? She hesitated, glancing around at the men. My father's journal. He was a surveyor for the railroad. He died 2 months ago, and I was bringing his final work to the company in San Antonio. A journal ain't worth your life, madam, one of the other volunteers said. Melanie straightened her spine. It is to me, and to the people who are counting on that survey to determine where the new rail line will run. The sheriff shook his head. I understand your concern, Miss Everhart, but I can't in good conscience let you ride after outlaws. Then I'll go alone. Her chin jutted forward in defiance. Quentin found himself speaking before he could think better of it. I'll escort Miss Everhart back to town. The rest of you can track the Rigby boys. We'll catch up once she's safe. The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue but merely nodded. Fine. But stay in town, Cooper. Don't go playing hero. As the others rode off, Quentin turned to Melanie. She was watching him with suspicion. I don't need an escort, Mr. Cooper. I need to find those men and recover my father's journal. Those men wouldn't think twice about putting a bullet in you, Quentin said flatly. The journal's not worth your life. You don't understand, she insisted, frustration coloring her cheeks. That journal contains more than just survey notes. It has evidence of corruption within the railroad company, men willing to sacrifice safety for profit. Quentin considered her for a long moment. She was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, perhaps both. And yet, there was something about her determination that he couldn't help but admire. I'll make you a deal, he finally said. We get the driver to town and then I'll help you track down the Rigby gang and recover your father's journal. Relief washed over her face. You will, on one condition, he added. You do exactly as I say. No arguments, no heroics. Deal. She hesitated only briefly before nodding. Deal, Mr. Cooper. Quentin, he corrected, helping her mount his horse while he checked on the injured driver. If we're going to be chasing outlaws together, we might as well be on a first-name basis. By nightfall, they had returned to Redemption Creek with the injured driver, who was now in the care of the town doctor. The sheriff and his posse had not returned, and Quentin feared they had either lost the trail or encountered more trouble than they'd bargained for. He found Melanie at the hotel, having purchased fresh clothes and cleaned up. She looked different without the dirt and blood softer somehow, though the determination in her eyes remained unchanged. We leave at first light, Quentin told her, ignoring the curious glances from other patrons. Get some rest. It's going to be a long ride. I'll be ready, she promised. And thank you, Quentin. Not many men would help a stranger like this. He shrugged uncomfortably. I'm not looking for trouble, but sometimes trouble finds you anyway. The next morning they set out before the sun had fully risen, the air still cool from the night. Quentin had acquired a second horse for Melanie, a steady bay mare that wouldn't spook easily. He'd also stocked up on supplies: water, jerky, ammunition for his revolver, and the Winchester rifle strapped to his saddle. Melanie rode beside him, wearing a divided skirt that allowed her to sit astride rather than side saddle. Her hair was braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and she had a determined set to her jaw. You know how to use this? Quentin asked, handing her a small revolver. She took it with confidence. My father taught me, said a woman traveling alone needed to protect herself. Smart man. He was, she agreed, a flash of grief crossing her features. He was also honest to a fault. When he discovered the railroad was cutting corners on the bridges using substandard materials that wouldn't hold up to the weight of the trains, he documented everything. Names, dates, locations. Quentin whistled low. No wonder they want that journal. That kind of information could ruin careers, maybe even the entire company. Exactly, and I intend to make sure it does. Those men put profit over people's lives. They rode in silence for a while, following the tracks left by the Rigby gang. The trail led them west through increasingly rugged terrain, toward a series of low hills dotted with scrubby pine trees. Around midday, they spotted smoke rising from beyond a ridge. Quentin signaled for Melanie to stop, and they dismounted, tethering their horses to a sturdy bush. "Stay low," he whispered as they crept forward on foot, "and let me do the talking if we run into anyone." They reached the top of the ridge and lay flat, peering down into a small canyon below. 3 men had made camp near a stream, their horses grazing nearby. A small fire crackled between them, and they appeared to be arguing. "That's them," Melanie breathed. "The one with the red neckerchief, he was the leader." Quentin studied the camp, noting the positions of the men and the lay of the land. "There's 3 of them and 2 of us. We'll need to be smart about this." "What's the plan?" He considered their options. A direct confrontation would be risky, but they had the element of surprise. "We wait until dark. They'll be sleeping, guard down. Then we slip in, find the journal, and slip out." Melanie frowned. "And what about justice? These men almost killed the driver. They've probably robbed dozens of coaches." "Justice is the sheriff's job," Quentin replied firmly. "Ours is to get your father's journal back without getting killed." They retreated to a safe distance to wait for nightfall, setting up a small camp of their own in a sheltered ravine. As the sun began to set, Quentin built a tiny, smokeless fire and prepared a meager meal of jerky and hard biscuits. "How did you end up out here?" Melanie asked as they ate. "You don't strike me as a drifter." Quentin poked at the fire with a stick. "I was a rancher's son. Had my own spread for a while up near the Colorado border. Then the war came, and after that, well, things changed." "You fought in the war," he nodded. "Confederate cavalry, saw things I wish I could forget." He didn't mention the years afterward, the bounties he'd collected, the men he'd tracked down, the blood on his hands. "When I came home, the ranch was gone. Taxes, debts. You know how it goes." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "My father and I moved around a lot with his work. After Mother died, it was just the 2 of us. I never really had a place to call home." "What will you do? After you deliver the journal, I mean." She looked into the fire, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know. I have some money saved, maybe buy a small piece of land somewhere quiet. Somewhere without outlaws and corrupt railroad men," Quentin suggested with a small smile. "Is there such a place?" she asked wryly. "If you find it, let me know." As darkness fell, they doused their fire and prepared to move on the outlaws' camp. Quentin checked his weapons one last time and turned to Melanie. "Stay behind me," he instructed. "And if anything goes wrong, you run. Don't wait for me, don't try to help. Just run." She nodded, though the set of her jaw told him she had no intention of leaving him behind. They approached the canyon stealthily, using the moonlight to guide their way down the slope. The outlaws' fire had burned down to embers, and 2 of the men were sprawled near it, snoring loudly. The third, the one with the red neckerchief, sat with his back against a boulder, a rifle across his lap. Quentin signaled for Melanie to stay put while he circled around to approach from behind. Moving with a silence born from years of hunting, he crept closer to the sentry. Just as he prepared to strike, his boot dislodged a stone, sending it clattering down the slope. The outlaw jerked to attention, raising his rifle. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cutting through the night. Quentin didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, tackling the man before he could fire. They crashed to the ground, struggling for control of the weapon. The outlaw was strong, but Quentin had desperation on his side. He wrenched the rifle away and brought the butt of it down hard on the man's temple. The commotion roused the other two outlaws who scrambled for their weapons. Cooper. Melanie's warning shout came just as the scarred outlaw fired, the bullet whizzing past Quentin's ear. He rolled behind the boulder, returning fire with the rifle he'd taken. One of the outlaws yelped in pain as a bullet grazed his arm. They scattered, taking cover behind rocks and trees. Melanie had drawn her revolver and was crouched behind a fallen log, eyes wide but steady. "The saddlebags," Quentin called to her, gesturing toward the outlaw's gear near the fire. "The journal might be there," she nodded, waiting for his signal. When he provided covering fire, she darted forward, reaching the saddlebags and rifling through them quickly. A cry of triumph told him she'd found what she was looking for. "Got it," she shouted, clutching a leather-bound book to her chest, but her moment of victory was short-lived. The outlaw with the scar lunged from behind a tree, grabbing her by the hair. He pressed a knife to her throat, using her as a shield. "Drop the gun, mister," he snarled at Quentin, "or the lady gets a new smile ear to ear." Quentin froze, his rifle aimed but useless while Melanie was in the line of fire. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also a calculating intelligence. She wasn't giving up. "Let her go," Quentin said evenly. "She's not part of this." "She made herself part of it when she stole from us," the outlaw replied. "Now drop the gun." Quentin's mind raced, searching for a way out. That's when he saw Melanie's hand inching toward her pocket, where he knew she kept her small revolver. "All right," he said, slowly lowering his rifle. "Just don't hurt her." The outlaw grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Smart man. Now kick it over here." Quentin pretended to comply, making a show of placing the rifle on the ground. As he straightened, he locked eyes with Melanie and gave an almost imperceptible nod. In one fluid motion, she pulled her revolver and fired behind her, the bullet catching her captor in the thigh. He howled in pain, loosening his grip enough for her to twist away. Quentin snatched up the rifle and fired at the other outlaw, who was emerging from cover. The night erupted in gunfire. Quentin pushed Melanie toward the canyon wall, providing cover as they retreated. They ran hard, scrambling up the slope toward where they'd left their horses. Behind them, they could hear the outlaws shouting, one of them clearly injured but all three in pursuit. They reached their horses, quickly untying them and swinging into the saddles. "Ride," Quentin urged, spurring his horse forward. They galloped through the darkness, navigating by moonlight and instinct. Quentin led them through a series of switchbacks, hoping to lose their pursuers. After what felt like hours, they finally slowed, listening. The night was quiet except for the sound of their horses' labored breathing. "I think we lost them," Melanie said, clutching the journal tightly. Quentin wasn't so sure. "We need to keep moving. Those men won't give up easily." They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. By dawn, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the outlaws, but Quentin remained vigilant. They found a secluded spot near a small stream to make camp and tend to their exhausted mounts. While Melanie refilled their canteens, Quentin scouted the area, making sure they were truly alone. When he returned, he found her sitting by the stream, the journal open on her lap. "It's all here," she said without looking up. "Every detail, every name." The railroad cut corners on the bridge supports, using inferior materials. My father calculated that they would fail within 5 years under the weight of the newer, heavier locomotives. Quentin sat beside her, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. And now. She closed the journal, determination hardening her features. Now I take this to San Antonio, to the newspaper there. The public needs to know before anyone gets hurt. The railroad won't like that. They have power, influence. They might come after you. Let them try. There was steel in her voice. I owe it to my father, to everyone who might cross those bridges to make this right. Quentin studied her face, impressed by her courage. In the soft morning light, with tendrils of auburn hair escaping her braid, she looked both vulnerable and indomitable. I'll take you to San Antonio, he heard himself saying. Make sure you get there safely. Surprise flickered across her features. You don't have to do that. You've already done more than enough. I know, but I want to. And he realized with some surprise that it was true. Somewhere between Redemption Creek and this quiet stream, Melanie Everhart had become more than just a woman in trouble. She had become someone he wanted to protect, to know better. They rested for a few hours before continuing their journey. Quentin estimated they were still 2 days from San Antonio, riding at a steady pace. They would need to be careful, not just because of the Rigby gang, but also because they couldn't be sure who else might be looking for that journal. By midday, they had reached more open country, the hills giving way to rolling grasslands dotted with mesquite trees. They were following a well-used trail that would eventually lead them to a small settlement where they could rest and resupply. As they rode, Melanie told Quentin more about her father, his dedication to his work, his principles, his love for her. In return, Quentin shared stories of his own childhood on the ranch, the lessons his father had taught him about honor and responsibility. He sounds like a good man, Melanie commented. You must miss him. Every day, Quentin admitted. He wouldn't approve of some of the choices I've made, but he always said a man can change his path if he's willing to work hard enough. Is that what you're doing, changing your path? He considered the question. Trying to, not always succeeding. They reached the settlement as evening approached, little more than a general store, a livery stable, and a handful of houses clustered around a dusty crossroads. They stabled their horses and secured a room at the small boarding house, where the elderly proprietress eyed them with suspicion, until Melanie quickly explained they were brother and sister traveling to visit family. After a simple but filling meal, they retired to their room, which contained 2 narrow beds separated by a threadbare curtain. Quentin offered to sleep in the stable, but Melanie insisted the arrangement was fine. I trust you, Quentin, she said simply. And after everything we've been through, a curtain seems rather trivial. He couldn't argue with that logic, though he maintained a respectful distance as they prepared for sleep. Just as they were settling in, a commotion outside drew his attention. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through the thin curtains. Riders, he said quietly, 3 of them. Melanie was instantly alert. The Rigby gang, can't tell, but I'm not taking chances. He grabbed his gun, belt, and hat. Stay here, keep the door locked. Don't open it for anyone but me. Before she could protest, he slipped out, making his way downstairs and out the back door of the boarding house. Circling around, he positioned himself in the shadows of the general store, watching as the 3 riders dismounted in front of the town's only saloon. They weren't the Rigby gang. These men wore suits beneath their dusters, and their horses were too fine for common outlaws. But something about them put Quentin on edge. They moved with purpose, and when one of them turned toward the lamplight, Quentin caught the gleam of a railroad company badge pinned to his vest. Railroad men. Looking for Melanie and the journal, no doubt. They must have telegraphed ahead to towns along the likely routes to San Antonio. Quentin slipped back to the boarding house, tapping a signal on the door that he and Melanie had agreed upon. She opened it immediately, relief washing over her face. "We need to leave," he said without preamble. "There are railroad men in town. They're looking for you." Her face paled, but she nodded resolutely. "How did they find us so quickly?" "Telegraph," he explained, gathering their meager belongings. "They're probably watching all the roads to San Antonio." "Then what do we do?" Quentin considered their options. "We avoid the main roads. Take a longer route cross-country. It'll be harder going, but they won't expect it." Within minutes, they had slipped out the back of the boarding house and made their way to the livery stable. The sleepy stable boy barely stirred as Quentin pressed a coin into his hand and led their horses out into the night. They rode hard until they were well clear of the settlement, then slowed to a more sustainable pace. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. Quentin led them southeast, away from the main trails, using the stars to navigate. "How do you know where we're going?" Melanie asked after a while. "My father taught me to navigate by the stars," he replied. "Said a man who can read the sky never needs to be lost." She smiled in the darkness. "My father used to say something similar. He taught me to use a sextant when I was 12. Smart man. He would have liked you," she said softly. "You remind me of him in some ways, the same sense of, I don't know, integrity." Quentin wasn't sure how to respond to that. It had been a long time since anyone had associated him with integrity. But something about the way Melanie looked at him made him want to be worthy of that assessment. They rode through the night and into the morning, stopping only when the horses needed rest. By noon, they had reached a small creek bordered by cottonwood trees, offering welcome shade from the midday sun. As they watered the horses, Quentin noticed Melanie swaying slightly on her feet. "You need to rest," he said, guiding her to sit beneath one of the trees. She didn't argue, which told him just how exhausted she must be. "Just for a little while," she conceded, leaning back against the trunk. Quentin busied himself setting up a small camp, all the while keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. He was starting to care for Melanie more than he should, and it worried him. Attachments were dangerous in his line of work, or at least they had been. But maybe it was time for that to change. While Melanie napped, Quentin checked their supplies and planned their route. They would reach San Antonio in 2 days if they pushed hard, avoiding main roads and settlements. Once there, Melanie could take her father's journal to the newspaper and then what? Would they part ways? The thought bothered him more than it should have. Melanie stirred, sitting up with a small groan. "How long was I asleep?" "About an hour," Quentin replied, offering her some jerky and hardtack. "Feeling better?" "Much." She accepted the food gratefully. "Thank you, Quentin, for all of this. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You would have managed," he said with a small smile. "You're tougher than you look." She laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the air around them. "Is that a compliment, Mr. Cooper?" "Absolutely, Miss Everhart." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the bond that had formed so quickly in the face of danger. Quentin looked away first, uncomfortable with the intensity of his own feelings. They resumed their journey as the afternoon waned, following the creek for a while before turning southeast again. The terrain grew more challenging, thickets of mesquite and cactus that forced them to pick their way carefully. But it also provided cover, making them harder to track. As dusk approached, they found a suitable spot to make camp, a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would shield any firelight from distant observers. Quentin set about gathering firewood while Melanie tended to the horses. They worked in companionable silence, moving around each other with an ease that suggested they had been traveling together for much longer than a few days. When the small fire was crackling and their simple meal prepared, they sat side by side, watching the flames dance. "Tell me about your ranch," Melanie said. "The one you had before the war." Quentin's expression softened at the memory. It wasn't much, 50 acres in a high valley, good water, decent grazing. The cabin leaked when it rained and the barn was always in need of repair, but it was mine. I had about 30 head of cattle, a few horses. Was hoping to expand, maybe try my hand at breeding stock. It sounds wonderful, she said wistfully. I've never had a place like that, a home that was truly mine. What would your home look like if you could have any place you wanted? She considered the question, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Something small, I think. A cottage with a garden, maybe near water, a creek or a small lake. Somewhere quiet but not too isolated. I'd like neighbors within riding distance. No bustling city life for you. She shook her head. I've had enough of cities. Too many people, too much noise, not enough sky. She looked up at the star-filled expanse above them. Out here you can breathe. Quentin nodded, understanding perfectly. That's how I feel about it too. They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence filled with unspoken understanding. Eventually they banked the fire and prepared to sleep, taking turns standing watch. Quentin took the first watch, sitting with his back against a rock, rifle across his knees. He watched Melanie as she slept, her face peaceful in the moonlight. Something stirred in his chest, a feeling he had thought long buried beneath years of wandering and regret. A feeling of possibility, of hope. The next day dawned clear and hot, the Texas summer asserting itself with a vengeance. They set out early, hoping to cover significant ground before the worst of the heat. Their path took them through increasingly rugged country hills and ravines that slowed their progress, but kept them well hidden from any pursuers. By midday, they had reached the edge of what Quentin recognized as Comanche territory. Though the tribe had been largely confined to reservations by this time, small bands still roamed these parts, and not all were friendly to travelers. "We need to be alert here," he warned Melanie. "This is Comanche land." She nodded, her hand straying to the revolver at her side. "Are they likely to attack two travelers?" "Depends on the band and how hungry they are," Quentin replied honestly. "But we're more likely to be left alone if we show respect. No hunting, no unnecessary noise." They proceeded cautiously, keeping to natural pathways and avoiding anywhere that might be considered sacred ground. The afternoon passed without incident, and Quentin began to hope they would cross the territory without encountering any of its rightful inhabitants. But as they descended into a narrow valley, Quentin spotted movement on the ridge above them. He raised a hand, signaling for Melanie to stop. "Don't make any sudden moves," he said quietly. "We've got company." 4 Comanche warriors sat atop paint ponies on the ridge, watching them with impassive faces. They were dressed for hunting, with bows slung across their backs and knives at their belts. Quentin slowly raised his hand in greeting, palm outward to show he meant no harm. One of the warriors, clearly the leader, returned the gesture before nudging his pony down the slope toward them. "Let me do the talking," Quentin murmured to Melanie. "I know a little of their language." The Comanche leader stopped a respectful distance away, assessing them with dark, penetrating eyes. "You are far from the white man's roads," he said in halting English. "We travel to San Antonio," Quentin replied, careful to keep his hands visible. "We mean no disrespect to your land." The warrior's gaze shifted to Melanie, curious rather than threatening. "The woman travels like a man." Melanie straightened in her saddle. "It's more practical for the journey," she said, her voice steady. A flicker of amusement crossed the warrior's face. "A woman with spirit like our own." He looked back at Quentin. "Why do you avoid the roads? Are you running from something?" Quentin hesitated, then decided honesty was the safest course. "Men who wish to silence her. She carries truth that powerful people don't want told." The warrior considered this, then nodded slowly. "Truth is sacred. Those who try to bury it are enemies of all people." He gestured to the valley ahead. "You may pass. There is a stream 2 miles ahead where you can rest. No white men have been seen there." "Thank you," Quentin said sincerely. "We will leave your land as we found it." The warrior raised his hand once more, then turned his pony and rejoined his companions on the ridge. They watched silently as Quentin and Melanie continued their journey. "That was fortunate," Melanie breathed once they were out of earshot. "More than you know," Quentin agreed. "The Comanche aren't known for their hospitality to strangers." They reached the stream the warrior had mentioned just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the valley. It was a beautiful spot, with clear water flowing over smooth stones and cottonwood trees providing ample shade. They made camp, keeping the fire small and smokeless as a sign of respect. As they prepared their evening meal, Melanie asked, "How did you learn to speak their language?" "I spent some time trading with them before the war," Quentin explained. "My father believed in treating all men with respect, regardless of their skin color or beliefs. He taught me that a little effort to understand someone's language goes a long way toward earning their trust." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." Quentin passed her a tin plate with a portion of the rabbit he'd snared earlier. "What about your mother? You haven't mentioned her much." Melanie's expression softened. "She died when I was 15. Fever took her one winter while my father and I were surveying in Montana. By the time we received word and returned home, she was already gone. I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," she said, though the sadness in her eyes suggested the wound was still tender. "She was beautiful and kind. Loved poetry. Used to read to me every night, even when I was old enough to read for myself. Said poetry was food for the soul." Quentin smiled. "My mother was more practical. Believed the only books worth reading were the Bible and almanacs." "And what do you believe?" He considered the question. "I think there's room for both. Practicality keeps you alive, but poetry reminds you why living matters." Melanie looked at him with new appreciation. "You're full of surprises, Quentin Cooper." They ate in companionable silence, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. When they had finished, Melanie took the journal from her saddlebag and opened it, running her fingers gently over her father's handwriting. "Would you like to see?" she offered, moving to sit beside him. "What makes this worth all the trouble?" Quentin nodded, genuinely curious. She turned the pages carefully, showing him detailed drawings of bridge supports, mathematical calculations, and observations written in a neat, precise hand. "Here," she said, pointing to a section near the back. This is where he documented the substitutions inferior iron used in place of steel, supports spaced too far apart to bear the load properly. "And these are the names of the men who ordered the changes, who signed off on them knowing they were creating a disaster waiting to happen." Quentin whistled low as he saw the names several high-ranking railroad officials, including a U.S. senator who sat on the Railroad Commission. "These are powerful men, Melanie. They won't take kindly to being exposed." "I know." Her face was set with determination. "But I can't let them get away with this. If one of those bridges fails with a passenger train on it." "I understand." And he did. Her courage, her sense of duty, reminded him of the man he had once hoped to be before the war, before the years of drifting and taking whatever work came his way. No questions asked. Their hands brushed as she turned a page, and neither pulled away immediately. When Quentin finally looked up from the journal, he found Melanie watching him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "What will you do?" she asked softly. "After San Antonio, I mean." He hadn't thought that far ahead. "I'm not sure. Find work, I suppose. Maybe head west to California." "You could come with me," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. After I deliver the journal, we could find that quiet place together. The offer hung between them, unexpected and full of possibility. Quentin searched her face, looking for signs of doubt or hesitation, but found only sincerity. "Melanie," he began, uncertain how to respond, "you barely know me." "I know enough," she countered. "I know you're a good man who risked his life to help a stranger. I know you treat everyone with respect, from Comanche warriors to stable boys. I know you navigate by the stars and appreciate poetry despite your practical upbringing." She took a deep breath. "And I know that when I'm with you I feel safe, not just physically safe, but whole. Like I've found something I didn't know I was missing." Her words stripped away his defenses, leaving him vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. "I'm not the man you think I am," he said quietly. "I've done things I'm not proud of, taken lives for money." "We've all made choices we regret," she replied, reaching out to touch his face. "What matters is the choice you make now and tomorrow and the day after that." He caught her hand, holding it against his cheek for a moment before gently lowering it. "Let's get to San Antonio first. Make sure your father's truth gets told. Then we can talk about what comes next." She nodded, accepting his caution but not defeated by it. "Fair enough, Quentin Cooper, but I want you to know that I meant what I said. Every word." They retired to their bedrolls soon after, each lost in thoughts of what the future might hold. Quentin took the first watch again, his mind replaying Melanie's words as he scanned the darkness for any sign of threat. Could he really start over? Create a life with this remarkable woman who had stormed into his existence just days ago? The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Dawn broke with a chorus of birdsong, the eastern sky painted in shades of pink and gold. They broke camp quickly and set out, both aware that this would likely be their last day of travel before reaching San Antonio. By Quentin's estimation, they would arrive by late afternoon if they maintained a steady pace. The landscape gradually changed as they rode, the rugged hills giving way to gentler terrain. Signs of civilization became more frequent: fenced pastures, the occasional farmhouse in the distance. Quentin felt a mixture of relief and regret as they drew closer to their destination. Relief that their dangerous journey was nearly complete, regret that it would soon be over. They stopped at midday beside a small pond, allowing the horses to drink while they stretched their legs. Melanie seemed contemplative, her usual animated conversation subdued. "Having second thoughts?" Quentin asked as they prepared to mount up again. She shook her head. "No, but I am thinking about what happens after. The railroad won't simply accept defeat when the story breaks. There will be consequences. We'll face them together," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "If that's what you want." Her smile was like sunrise after a long night. "It is." They rode on, the miles passing beneath their horses' hooves. As the sun began its westward descent, they crested a rise and saw San Antonio spread out before them, a bustling city of adobe and wooden buildings, with the distinctive shape of the Alamo visible near its center. "We made it," Melanie breathed, relief evident in her voice. Quentin nodded, scanning the approaches to the city. "Let's avoid the main gates. There might be men watching for us." They circled around to a less frequented entrance, blending in with a group of farmers bringing produce to market. Inside the city walls, Quentin led them to a small hotel he remembered from a previous visit, not so fine that it would draw attention, but clean and reputable enough for Melanie's comfort. After securing a room, two this time, side by side, they discussed their next move over a meal in the hotel's modest dining room. "The San Antonio Express offices are on Commerce Street," Quentin said, keeping his voice low. "But we should be careful. The railroad might have men watching there too." Melanie nodded, thoughtfully cutting her steak. What if I don't go to the newspaper directly? What if we make copies of the journal first, send them to multiple newspapers? That way, even if one is suppressed, the truth still gets out. Quentin considered the idea. Smart. We could hire a scribe to make the copies overnight, then deliver them tomorrow, one to the Express, one to the Austin paper, maybe even send one to St. Louis or Chicago. Exactly. Her eyes shone with determination. They can't stop all of them. After dinner, they sought out a scribe, an elderly man with spectacles and arthritic hands who nonetheless produced beautifully legible copies. They paid him well for his discretion and speed, arranging to collect the finished work the following morning. Back at the hotel, they stood in the hallway between their rooms, reluctant to part. "Tomorrow will be busy," Quentin said. "You should rest." Melanie nodded but made no move toward her door. "Quentin," she began, then hesitated. "I meant what I said about us, about finding a place together." He looked at her, this brave, principled woman who had turned his carefully constructed solitude upside down in the space of a few days. "I know you did, and I want that too." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. But Melanie's smile made the leap worthwhile. "Then let's make it happen," she said simply. "After tomorrow, we'll start looking for our home." "Our home," he repeated, liking the sound of it. Impulsively, he leaned forward and kissed her gently at first, then with growing intensity as she responded. Her arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find someone like you," he admitted. "Someone who makes me want to be better than I am." "You already are better than you think," she replied softly. "Good night, Quentin." "Good night, Melanie." The next morning, they collected the copied journals from the scribe and set about their plan. Quentin delivered one copy to the San Antonio Express, presenting it to the editor with a brief explanation of its significance. Melanie took another to a lawyer she had heard was trustworthy, arranging for legal protection against potential retaliation. The third copy they mailed to the Chicago Tribune, along with a detailed letter. By afternoon, the wheels were in motion. The Express editor, recognizing the explosive nature of the story, promised to begin investigating immediately. The lawyer agreed to file injunctions preventing the railroad from building or operating on the compromised bridges until inspections could be conducted. As dusk fell, Quentin and Melanie stood on the balcony of their hotel, watching the city transition from day to night. There was a sense of completion, of a journey ended and a new one about to begin. "What now?" Quentin asked, his arm around Melanie's shoulders. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "Now we find our place. Somewhere quiet with good water and decent grazing. A garden for me, space for your horses. And a roof that doesn't leak when it rains," he added with a smile. "That's negotiable," she teased. "I hear you're handy with repairs." Quentin laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I suppose I am. My father made sure of that." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. The same stars that had guided them here, that would guide them to wherever they would make their home. "I was never looking for trouble," Quentin said softly, "but I'm glad it found me." Melanie smiled up at him. "So am I." 1 month later, they stood on the porch of a small ranch house nestled in a valley 40 miles west of San Antonio. It wasn't much 100 acres with good water and decent grazing, a sturdy house that needed some work but didn't leak when it rained, and a barn that was always in need of repair. But it was theirs. The railroad scandal had broken wide open, with multiple newspapers carrying the story. The senator had resigned in disgrace, and the railroad was under federal investigation. There had been threats, attempts at intimidation, but they had weathered them together. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Quentin wrapped his arms around his wife. They had married in a small ceremony in San Antonio before buying the ranch, starting their new life with promises that both intended to keep. Happy? He asked, although he knew the answer from the contentment in her eyes. Melanie turned in his embrace, reaching up to touch his face. More than I ever thought possible. Quentin had never looked for trouble, had tried his best to avoid it. But when trouble found Melanie Everhart on that dusty stagecoach road, it had led him to something he hadn't known. He was searching for a purpose, a partner, a home. And for that, he would be forever grateful.